Bring your fingertips to the sides of your blankets and just take a moment to allow for some time to extend and lift upwards through your torso. Now, our practice today is going to hopefully embrace I'm going to call it the 3 aspects of our embodiment, which is the mind and the body and the breath. And later on in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali describes, most of you know, Sthira Sukham Asanam, that an asana should have steadiness and stability and ease. And part of that steadiness and ease comes from a sensitivity of integration and interaction between the body and the mind and the breath. So with your fingertips down, slightly bend your elbows, that's it. And now lengthen and lift yourself upwards. Now press your hands so much that you can lift the buttocks slightly upwards and move the buttocks ever so slightly back. So that when you bring the hips down, bring your pelvis back down, that you're slightly more to the front edge of your sit bones. And then lengthen upwards. Now release your hands and join your palms together at chest level and close your eyes from top to bottom. And before we chant the invocation to Patanjali and chant the 3 Oms, just take a moment to be in your embodiment. And Prashant Iyengar gives some wonderful images about cultivating sensitivity. He says there are several sensitivities, and each of our sensitivities change every moment. For example, a toothbrush is different to a hairbrush, is different to a foot brush. And there are different sensitivities even in a painter's brush. And so when you work in your practice, you have to work with changed senses. And when you work with various sensitivities, you become prepared for various conditions that life brings. So through cultivating sensitivity, you are seasoning yourself to accept the inevitability of change. Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaijakena yopakarotam pravaram munina patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi abahu purushakaram Shankha Chakra Siddharanam Sahasrashya Samshretam Pranamami Patanjalim Hari Om. On your exhalation, now release your head down. Bring your hands down, turn your palms up, and then raise your head up with your eyes closed and gently open your eyes. Okay. We're going to set up for Supta Baddha Konasana as our first pose today. So you will need to have a belt, a bolster, and a blanket. And some of you may need more of those props, or certainly no fewer of those props. And I'm going to show the setup. So one of the things about a restorative practice is that we do use props. And to cultivate a sensitivity to the props that you need is not only an exercise in practice and discipline, but it is also requires in many ways a level of interest, right? So you're going to take your belt and make a loop in your belt. I'm going to show this part because I know for some of you, the use of the belt in Supta Baddha Konasana is not always the way you would practice it. And there are some of you in the group who use 2 belts, right? If you have any real differences in your hips, it's often beneficial to use 2 belts. So if you have 2 of these white belts and you're working with differences in your hips like Dot, you may find that 2 belts are better than 1, right? Especially folks with scoliosis, because then you can really appreciate the differences in the 2 sides. But I'm going to show with 2 belts, but first of all, just with the single belt, so that you sit in front of your bolster and the legs will come to Baddha Konasana. And the belt, as I said, is a looped belt. And then you'll take the belt over the head and shoulders and take it all the way to the top of the sacral area, to the top of the buttocks. And then you have to bring the belt between your legs and underneath your feet. And if you could just notice again, if you haven't done this before, that the buckle should not touch your skin, right? The buckle should not touch your limb. It should be in between. And that the tail side of the belt should pull towards your torso, right? Not away from it. And then once you've got the belt in place, you get to pull the belt and adjust the buckle, right? Until the belt is as tight as you can tolerate. And then again, make sure that the buckle is not touching your skin, right? So it goes between the legs, yep, and you have to pull the belt the loop quite long to get it in place. Right? And then of course you get to lie down on your support. And then the next aspect of this setup will be, what do you do with the blanket under your head? Right? What do you do with the blanket under your head? So the blanket should support your head and neck in such a way that the back of the neck is long and that your throat is soft. Right? That the back of the neck is long and the throat is soft. And these props of themselves are not sensitive. Right, so you have to create that sensitivity in yourself, and you know it does require a level of interest, right? So that the pose is never really the same each time you practice it. But when you do lie back, you have a support that keeps the back of the neck long and keeps the throat soft. So if you're unclear about the position of the head, I'm going to show the 2 extremes. Right, sometimes we find ourselves with too much of the throat exposed and the chin releasing towards the forehead this direction. So to remedy this, you'd have to put another blanket underneath your head. Right? The other extreme is perhaps you have too much height underneath your neck, and what would happen then, or what could potentially happen then, is that your chin drops down, causing a hardness in your throat. Right? And so we seek to find a balance so that the throat is soft and the back of the neck is long and your arms can release to the side. To come on out, you can flip the buckle of the belt, release one of your feet, and then come out that way, okay? Now, some of you I know are interested in taking the 2 belts. So if you're using 2 belts, you would just go over the top of the thigh as close as you can make it. And you would obviously just use 1 belt for each leg. And then you have to make sure that it's even, right? So those of you using 2 belts, this would be your setup. And I certainly recommend that for any of us with sacroiliac issues, certainly hip and knee imbalances. And this double belt can give you a different kind of feedback, right? Because it lets the legs operate independently. All right, but make sure that you pull the belt so that it's as tight as you can. And then when you come back down, you can lengthen the top of the buttock area in the direction of your heels, in the direction of your feet. Yeah, Dot, I'm thinking that would probably be better for you. Yeah. So going back to Prashant's understanding of sensitivities, and we know this to be so obvious in our daily lives, the difference between a toothbrush and a hairbrush, and how we would use those tools differently because of their difference in rather different sensitivities for the task for which they were created. So as you let go of your arms and your legs here, the sensitivity is to observe where your breath is moving. And you don't have to change your breath, but be sensitive to where the breath moves. When we begin to observe our breath, it is best to experience it as a sensation. In other words, how our breath creates movement in the muscles of the torso, creates movements in the organic body, and sometimes even creates movements in the arms and in the legs. But just observe your breath with sensitivity, and observe if you feel your breath in your inner thighs, perhaps even in your groins. And can you feel the breath in your abdominal cavity? And can you feel the breath in your chest cavity? And how does your breath touch your shoulders and your arms? And how does your breath feel as it moves through your throat? And how does your breath feel in your eyes? And each and every one of these sensitivities and feelings is different. And certain feelings and sensitivities are much more subtle than those of the difference between a toothbrush and a hairbrush. Prashant writes, the breath is active, sensitive, perceptive, pensive, meditative, reflective. And he invites us to treat the breath like a patient in intensive care, watching with that level of sensitivity and care and maitri and loving kindness. If it's tolerable for your back, you're going to take your arms now overhead and hold onto your elbows. But if it bothers your shoulders or it bothers your back, just leave your arms where they are. Shelley, if it's bothering your hips, you can put blocks underneath your thighs. Now, something just changed. Can you observe now the feeling of your breath? And I'm terming this a very physical feeling. Sensation involves our senses. And the sense of touch is probably the most appropriate sense to be using at this point. Where does the breath touch? In your legs, in your arms? Does the breath touch your abdomen? And how does the breath feel in your chest cavity? Now switch the cross of your elbows and let the arms release back and down. Some of you know Viloma 1. If you don't, I'll explain it as we take a few moments of taking a Viloma 1 breath. So Viloma 1, I'll just get the whole sentence out, means that you interrupt your inhaling breath into 3 sections. So you'll inhale and pause and wait, and then inhale and wait, and then you'll inhale to the top of your chest and wait, and then exhale your breath. So after your next exhalation, take a couple of rounds of Viloma 1. Exhale the breath and inhale and pause. And inhale and pause. And inhale to the top of the chest and pause. And then exhale the breath out. So the breath is more active. So observe again the sensations in your abdomen, in your chest, in your arms, in your legs, in your eyes, in your face. All of these different sensitivities as you change your breath. And now release your arms. And then you're just going to carefully undo the belt or belts and bring your legs together. And let your feet rest on the floor for a moment. And then carefully roll over to your side and come on up. You can stretch out your legs for a moment. Now, our next pose is Supta Virasana, and I'm aware that for some of you, this requires a significantly different prop setup. And I'm going to encourage you today to investigate that. But the basic setup will be a bolster and a blanket and for your head. And those of you who can tolerate a belt, you'll be taking a belt over your thighs. And I'm going to speak about that in a moment. So everyone just get whatever you need. If it's hard to lie back, there are a couple of extra props that you can take. One is an extra bolster, and that you would place that bolster slightly stepped back, you see. And then you can place a block under the shelf there. And you can also prop up on top of the bolster several blankets. And this would be so that you would sit on the lower support and that your torso would extend, your spine would extend over the higher support. And that you may need a few more blankets for your head if you're taking this higher support. Okay? But just a word for those of you who are using a belt, and I recommend if Supta Virasana is complex for you, that you don't use a belt, right? That you don't use a belt. And if Supta Virasana is impossible for you, you just do seated cross, you just do lying down cross-leg position. All right? But just for a moment, just watch. So the belt is an interesting prop in Virasana and Supta Virasana. Because we often talk about using the belt just to keep the thighs, together in the pose. And for some of us, that's really not a particularly effective tool to use the belt for. So I mentioned at the beginning about having a weight around. We're not going to be using weights, but the belt has a very similar effect to placing a weight on your legs. And so the belt can be positioned towards the tops of the thighs, towards the middle of the thighs, and even a little bit towards the lower side of the thighs, and not directly on the knees, however. And each of these positions, and there are of course many in between, will have a slightly different effect on your Supta Virasana. And so, you know, the middle is obviously the middle, right? And that would be a place to start to investigate this. But those of you who do this pose regularly and you have an understanding of what the belt can do for the pose, then it's time to, again, take that level of interest to a different place to investigate what would happen if I took the belt higher up towards the tops of the legs, and what would happen if I took the belt a little further away, right? And, you know, I can speak about my own experience in this, but I'll wait for you to investigate it. But if you are using a belt, then the belt would go over your shins and over your thighs. And again, you could place the buckle in the center so it's not touching either leg, okay? And again, if this pose is complex for you, either you can do lying down cross legs, take a few moments sitting in Virasana, however, and then you can do a cross-leg position and lie back with cross legs. Okay, we'll be here for about 3 to 5, I say 3 to 5 minutes. Those of you in cross legs will need to make sure that you switch the cross of your legs, right? That you switch the cross of your legs. Okay. And Irene, if you can tolerate this belt, for you, if you can tolerate it, make it a little further away from the midline, just slightly closer to your knees, because you'll find that that's going to reach all the way up into the front of your diaphragm, right? And again, if that becomes too intense, you just take the belt off. But the further away the belt is from the roots of the legs, in many ways, the higher up the torso it affects, right? The closer the belt is to the roots of the thighs, the more direct it will be to the lower abdomen and the groins. Okay, so those of you who are not doing Supta Virasana, you're going to take a moment or two just sitting in Virasana, and you can sit up on a height just so that you can appreciate the extension of the front thighs that Virasana gives. Those of you who are ready to lie back, go ahead and lengthen yourself, your torso over the support and lie back. And then once you've been in seated Virasana for a minute or so, those of you who are not lying back, then you can adjust yourself into a Supta, a lying down, cross-legged position, right? Lying down, cross-legged position. Okay. Yeah, Laura, I would have done exactly that for you. Definitely the position of the belt there. Yeah. Okay. Kate, if you can, I don't know if you can put that block or another blanket under your head, that would be good. Again, setting up for these supine poses requires a level of interest. And that level of interest evolves, of course, over time and with practice, but it's primarily to begin to evolve into our sensitivities and begin to work with our sensitivities. We begin in our practice with the outermost layer of the body. And even though the tool for our practice today is to feel how the breath moves, it is very much felt on the outer body, at least to start with. Kala, if you can put a support under your head, that would be good. Reach your quadriceps towards your outer knees. Let the outer knees, outer shins release down. And just feel your body with your breath. That's all. Feel how the breath affects your legs. Feel how the breath moves through the abdominal cavity. observe how the breath shifts into your chest cavity. And how the breath touches your collarbones. And again, observe that the feeling, and I'm calling it the feeling, the sensitivity, perhaps of touch, of stretch, extension. These are all slightly different. There are grades in a painter's brush to express sensitivity, Prashant writes. And each of the sensitivities you're experiencing in your Supta Virasana from your breath are different grades of sensitivity. And we learn to work with changed senses, not labeling these sensitivities as good or bad or what we like or what we don't like, but simply embracing them as an experience. As Pema Chodron said, just to begin to get to know yourself with loving kindness. Now, once again, if it's tolerable for your shoulders and for your back, you'll take your arms overhead. Those of you with crossed legs, make sure that you switch the cross of your legs. Now, of course, this changes everything. The armpits extend, and there's even perhaps a sense that the armpits become thinner, narrower, and that the breath is able to reach into different places with different sensitivities. These supine, reclining poses, Supta Baddha Konasana, Supta Virasana, are a whole body experience. And perhaps you can feel how your whole body, even your legs and arms, but particularly your torso, your abdomen and your chest are involved and moving with your breath. That the breath isn't isolated to one particular part, and that each part has its own journey of sensitivity. Now take those Viloma 1 breaths once again, so that there is an interrupted inhalation. So after your next exhalation, inhale and pause. Inhale and pause. Inhale to the top of your chest, and then exhale the breath. And just do a few rounds of this. So the breath begins, again, as Prashant says, it's active, it's sensitive, it's perceptive. And these are all attributes to observing how the breath feels in the, I'm going to call it the outer body, muscular, skeletal. Feeling the stretches, releases, extensions. And then release your arms down, and then you're going to carefully, slowly bring yourself up and sit for a moment, and then you can undo your legs and stretch your legs out. You can stretch your legs out in Dandasana or in Uttanasana. Okay, all right. All right, so our next pose is going to be Adho Mukha Svanasana. And the prop setup is so dependent on you because the prop setup is such that you're going to investigate the sensitivity of how your breath feels in your whole torso. And so you may have to adjust the height under your hands. You may have to do this with your heels at the wall or your hands at the wall. You'll definitely take a support for your head. I'm going to give a couple of examples as to what this might look like. But first of all, before you make any changes, so we'll probably end up doing it once or twice. Before you make any changes, just take downward facing dog now and arrange your head support. So you may need a bolster for your head. You may be able to have a bolster and a blanket. You may be able to have a blanket which can be folded into 4 or into 3. And if you're working with any sort of shoulder issue, it's really best to have your hands at the wall. But I'm going to be, watching, and I'm going to ask you, of course, that you feel where your downward facing dog is taking you in terms of your breath. Okay, so go ahead and get ready. The initial structure of the pose has to be with the external body. Okay.
Jess?
Yeah.
Where is our head supposed to be on the support?
On the crown of your head. Be on the crown of your head, and that might change. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute because it really depends, again, on the sensitivity of your breath. But go ahead and start off taking the crown of your head down. Is a good question. Thank you, Kensia. Okay. So straighten your arms and your legs. And see if you can incorporate some of the sensitivity that you experienced in your torso from the previous 2 poses in this pose. Do you feel the breath in the chest cavity in the same way that you did in Supta Baddha Konasana or in Supta Virasana? Do you feel the movement of your breath in your abdominal cavity in the same way that you did in either of those poses, even though they were very different? Because as I look around, the various shapes of Adho Mukha Svanasana definitely change where the breath is moving and working. Okay, everyone come on down and rest for a moment. So just have a look and see. So I'm going to invite you to perhaps, change your pose in a way that will allow for more space and room so that the entirety of your torso is involved in Adho Mukha Svanasana. So when I see a pose, I'm going to use the bolster for head support. When I see the pose, that is very much where the weight is much more on the hands than on the feet. And you see how my back is rounded slightly, the upper part of the back is rounded. There is a very limited movement of breath. The breath ends up staying much more in the rib cage, and the abdomen almost has a hardness to it. And so if that's your pose, and for those of us who have tighter hips and hamstrings, that's often where the pose ends up. You'll have a lot more weight on your hands than on your feet. It's really beneficial to take support for your hands. And that support can be with 2 blocks, and you would have to turn yourself around so that you're at the wall. And you can see that by raising my hands up, already it's giving me a little bit more space to press the thighs back and get more length in the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity. And just to be clear, the chest cavity, we know this is the chest box, as the Iyengars would call it, and then the abdominal cavity is of course, this whole band here, okay? And taking a higher support can also be as high as a chair, right? And for this one, you wouldn't necessarily have your head supported, right? So this may be the most beneficial so that you can feel your whole torso being involved with this pose. Right, so that's the level of sensitivity we're working on here, that it's not just to feel the breath in the chest, the rib cage area, but even in the whole abdomen, so that you can feel the ebb and flow of breath. So that was the most of what I was looking at, was for certain of you that it's much more beneficial to raise your hands up, right? And if you're curious about what that would feel like, do it today and just see. So to answer Kessia's question, when you do, when we take this pose, there are positions to put your head, and the crown of the head will do something very different for your breath than coming on more to your forehead. So again, today is about your sensitivity. So play with it, and you might notice that being on the crown of your head will take the breath to a different place than being on the forehead. And that there might be a place for you where you can not just create the map of Adho Mukha Svanasana, but really understand the territory of the breath in Adho Mukha Svanasana. And that it might mean that for today, you take your head a little lower and you come to the crown of your head, or that you're more on the forehead, or the list is endless, right? But take your pose today as a breath pose, right? As a breath pose. And so that you're working to create an experience for your breath, right? Using the extension of your arms and legs. Those of you who are using ropes for Adho Mukha Svanasana, that's fine, but it will change your breath. So go ahead and come into the pose. And there were particularly, yeah, Irene, that's much better. Ellen, that was a good choice. And Susie, remember that adjustment that we spoke about? You know, imagine I'm hugging your blades in. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Marina, that's definitely different, right? You feel how different that is. Okay. So we begin, as we always do, with the outer body, the extension of the arms and legs. And I'm not giving really any particular instructions for those parts. But you're going to observe, again, the feeling, the change in sensitivity. There are many sensitivities. And part of the reason why those supine poses are practiced so much in restorative work is because it invites us to feel the entirety of the torso in our breath. That the breath will affect the movement of your chest, and the breath will affect the movement of your abdomen. And the breath needs to be felt in these places. Irene, I would even go higher with your hands. And we're only holding this pose for maybe another minute, minute and a half. And your breath will change because of that as well. Because as Prashant says, the breath has to be active. We use a different kind of breath to walk up a hill than we walk down a hill. And with that active breath, we also have to increase our level of sensitivity. Can you feel your entire torso? Can you let your breath be felt in your abdominal cavity? What part of your breath is felt in your abdomen? What part of your breath is felt in your chest? What part of your breath is felt in your front ribs? What part of your breath is felt in your back ribs? And each is a different sensitivity, like a painter's brush, a different brush for different techniques. Let your head and neck release, and for the last 20, 30 seconds in the pose, adjust your head if you have it on a support and observe, does that change where the breath moves? And it's not about being right or wrong, it is about your level of sensitivity to observe what you need at this moment. My treat. All right, and then from your exhale and release and come down. Rest. Okay. Okay. So those of you who do Shirshasana, we're going to take headstand. And those of you who are not taking headstand today, you're going to do another forward bend. but you're going to take it with a head support, and you can use a chair for Uttanasana, and you can have your feet at least as wide as the outer edges of your sticky mat, right? For those of you who are not doing head balance. And so you would take a chair and you can put something on the chair to support your head. But you'll be taking a wide-legged Uttanasana. And you notice where I put my arms. You can hold your elbows and extend your elbows onto the chair seat. And then everybody else get ready for Shirshasana. Okay. Remember to take care of what you need today for your breath. And particularly in Uttanasana, right? Those of you in Shirshasana can go on in, but those of you in Uttanasana, pay particular attention to where the breath is felt and where it is not felt. So that the front of the diaphragm isn't hard and compressed. But can you create space from the extension of your legs and the extension of your upper arms to again find some of that, I'm going to call it that feeling of where the breath moves in your abdominal cavity and in your chest cavity. And that we work to create, and I hesitate to even say an evenness, but that the breath should not only be felt in the chest. That the breath should not just be felt in the side ribs. But that the breath is also felt in this abdominal area. So that breathing, and we're not even, this is not a rarefied pranayama breathing, this is just respiration, is a whole torso experience. And that the length of our torso is dependent on the extension of our arms and legs. And so those of you in Shirshasana, can you observe again the feeling of where your breath is? Can you feel the breath in your side chest? Can you feel the breath in your side ribs? Can you feel the breath in your front ribs? And can you feel the breath in your back ribs? And being sensitive to that place where adjustments may need to be made. If the front ribs are pushing too far forwards, then the back of the diaphragm is hard and the front of the diaphragm is overworking. And can you observe the breath in your abdominal cavity? And adjustments need to be made if that is not the case. For those of us who do Shirshasana and have a tendency to let the front ribs come forwards, it often means that you can barely feel the breath in the abdomen. And the pose can become very heavy with the breath in the chest cavity. The pose has a sense of sinking down with your breath. But if those front ribs are able to draw slightly into the body, you may notice that the breath is felt more evenly throughout the entire torso, and the pose can evolve to have a lightness to it. And same with those of you in Uttanasana. Can you observe the length of your front body, the side body, the back body? Feel your breath in your whole torso today. B, front ribs in, so much more. And then thighs up. Push the tailbone strongly inwards. It would be good, B, for you at some point to do the pose with your heels at the wall so that you can really work to pull your front ribs back to the wall. Don't do it today, but it would just be beneficial for you to feel the wall behind you, particularly with your back ribs. And then from here, exhale and release and come on down. Those of you in Uttanasana, come on up. Okay. Just rest for a moment. So we're going to set up, we're going to do 3 poses that are similar in shape, but are hopefully going to give or create different sensitivities in investigating how the breath moves through the entire torso. That seems to be, that was the theme that I was working on today. And one of the reasons is it came from a comment that Gita wrote in this wonderful text, the Women's Intensive text, which I've been devouring over the last year. And she says, for beginners, we only ever breathe into our chest, right? For beginners, we only ever breathe into our chest. And that this creates tremendous hardness in the abdomen and in the diaphragm. And it also decreases our sensitivity, right? And as Prashant illuminatingly says here, when we decrease our sensitivity, rather when we increase our sensitivity, we prepare ourselves for the various conditions of life, right? And in James Nestor's book on breath, he talks about the science behind top chest breathing and the science behind more whole torso breathing. And that when we breathe only into the top part of the chest, it is a fight and flight breath, right? It is a type of breath that we use when we're panicked. And the breath can be very shallow. And it also can be a very demonstrative breath. So it's like a, you know, that kind of breathing, right? And that's a very shallow breath. And Gita says this is for beginners, right? When we start to talk about the breath, it's just here. And that if we're able to breathe into the lower parts, right, into the abdominal area, the lower parts, then this scientifically activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So it becomes a very different experience. And we work with our asanas to create this whole apparatus for becoming sensitive. Sensitive to the movement of breath. So everyone, I'm going to turn the heat up. Everyone go ahead and get a bolster and a couple of blankets. If you have 2 bolsters, you can take 2. We're taking cross bolsters. And I will just show you 2 bolsters because it's easier to see. If you don't have 2, then you would just substitute the lower bolster for a couple of blankets, right? Substitute the lower bolster for a couple of blankets, they will work just fine. Now, if you can be close to a wall and you can take your feet to the wall, you can do that. But I realize that for some of you, you know, being close to the wall isn't so easy. So you can be wherever you are. And also, for those of you who use the belt in Supta Virasana, feel free to use the belt over your thighs in this cross bolsters position. And we're going to only take one piece of this pose. So once you've got your setup, if you could just look and see. It's sometimes nice to have a blanket for your head if you're on a mat so that your head doesn't get stuck on the mat. If we had another few hours, we would do each of these poses with the belt in different places, but we don't. So I'm going to leave that with your interest to observe how it's different to have the belt closer to the torso and further away, because it does change your breath, right? So from here, you get to sit on one edge of the bolster and tip back, right, so that your head comes down. But notice from here that the shoulders are not on the floor, and the upper back is fully supported on the bolster, but the neck is not. Right? So I'm resting on the back of the crown of the head, right? Not on the crown and not on the back, but just halfway between. And then the arms can release to the side. And then from here, you're going to work to just extend your legs out. And we'll be here working with, again, this sensitivity as to how the breath feels in the torso. And then when you're coming out, you'll bend your legs. You can slide yourself all the way off. Okay, and then roll to your side. The belt is really optional, right? If the belt just seems one too many things to think about, don't use it. All right. That's it. So the head is on the floor, but the shoulders are not. Yeah, there we go. If this becomes too much for your back, your lower back, just do this with bent legs. Palms can turn upwards towards the ceiling. Again, if you can be by a wall, you can extend your inner heels to the wall. And those of you with belts, you may notice that the belts almost act as a weight. So if I was to come and put a weight on your thighs, if the belt was closer to the tops of your thighs, it would behave similarly to the belt. In other words, it would bring a certain kind of restriction or extension to a certain part of your thighs, which would affect a certain part of your torso. And I once asked, I've asked several teachers in therapeutic settings, where do you know to put the weight? Where do you know to put the belt? The answer is always the same: practice. And so for those of us with any sort of lower digestive issues, taking the belt towards the roots of the thighs may be of some benefit to release the groins, broaden the lower abdomen. And for those of us with different kinds of perhaps organic issues higher up towards the diaphragm itself, strangely enough, taking the belt a little further away towards the mid-thighs or even a little closer to the knees can have a very different effect. But that is your exploration. So feel the breath and where it moves. Paying particular attention, of course, to how the breath feels in the abdominal cavity and how the breath feels in the chest cavity. And that the prop that you have created may give more or less emphasis to one or other. And as I look around, just observing that Setu Bandha can be set up in hundreds of different ways, but that you might find that this particular variation gives a little bit more feeling or sensation in the chest cavity. Particularly on your inhaling breath. and that the exhalation may be felt a little bit more in the abdominal cavity. But just observe how, again, the breath involves your entire torso. And that one of the reasons why we work in our restorative poses, and of course in our non-restorative poses, although probably every pose is restorative on certain levels, is because it creates space in the groins and in the legs. It creates openness across the chest. And that invites more space for the breath. When the shoulders are tight, the breath has restriction of movement. When the groins are tight, the breath has restriction of movement. Okay, and then from here to come on out, you'll bend your legs one at a time and carefully slide yourself out. And then when you're ready, you'll roll over to your right side. And we're going to set up for Purvottanasana, a supported variation of a pose called Purvottanasana. And in Purvottanasana, this is extension of the front body. And the back of the heart, the back body is supported. And we're going to see if as many of you as can use a chair for this. It's hard if you don't have a chair, you can thread your legs between. And so I'm going to be giving a bolster variation as well. But if you have a chair, take a chair and a bolster. And if you're taller, you may need a bolster and a couple of blankets. If you're not so tall, just a bolster should be fine. And again, if you can position yourself close to a wall, then that can be very helpful for this pose. Okay, so I'm just going to adjust the camera here so you can see. So this pose may require a little bit of finessing. And that's really mainly dependent on your height. So you're going to put a bolster on the chair. If you're my height, and those of you know me know my height, I would put a blanket on top of this bolster. If you're a little shorter than me, you probably wouldn't need it. But if you're taller, you may well need another blanket or even a second bolster. So I'm just going to show without the extra blanket so that you can just see how I would get into this. You can, of course, use your belt over your thighs once again. This is not the same as back bend in the chair, Dvipada Viparita Dandasana. So I sit on the bolster, and notice the bolster is all the way on the front of on the chair. I haven't got it hanging over the back edge of the chair. But I lift the buttocks, and I'm still on the bolster. But I lengthen the buttocks away towards the wall and lie back, so that my neck and head is supported on the bolster. And you can hold on to the edges of the chair. And then there are two positions for your feet. One is to extend the heels to the wall like this. And the other one is more like Purvottanasana, which is to extend the ball mounds and the big toes towards the wall like so. Okay? Again, each of these has different effects on the sensitivity, on your sensitivity and on the movements of your breath. We're going to be, you can hold your hands like this, or you can eventually extend your arms over and hold on to your elbows once again. Right? But the legs are straight and the arms will extend over. So the idea is, again, you're fully supporting the back of the chest, you're fully supporting your neck and your head, and the pelvis is also on the support. To come on out, you'll bend your legs, bend your elbows. What I tend to do is slide a little further back so that when I come up, the bolster will just fall off, right? But if it doesn't, it's okay. So again, if you're taller than, I mean, I'm going to show now with the blanket. Because certainly from my height, I find that I get a bit more space to breathe, right? So this is all about creating space to breathe. So it would be a little like this, and some of you perhaps can see the difference. Now there's just more extension of the front thighs with a slightly higher support. My head and neck is still supported, but there's definitely more of an arc from the heels all the way to the crown. My head is tilted slightly back, but the neck is still supported. Okay, so Purvottanasana, eventually, of course, you know, those of you know this, the unsupported variation, the head does hang back. Right? And this is a really important pose to get to know in its restorative, in its restorative capacity. Okay. Now there are some of you who don't. I'm just going to look around. Who doesn't have a chair that you can do this with? Okay, Ellen. Okay, so there are a few of you. All right, good. So if you don't have one of these chairs, you're going to stay with your cross bolsters, Ellen, but you're going to do it a little differently, right? Because I'm going to try and get you to have at least a similar experience. So you would take, do you see how I have the cross bolster? And then you're going to put a block under the edge that you're going to, it's too high. You're going to put a block under the edge you're going to lean back on. And then you would have to have, probably for you, a blanket or maybe another, maybe a blanket and a half, or a block. But you're going to be taking the pose like this. So it's really important. This is for those of you who don't have a chair, right? That you have a support, a hard support underneath the back of your heart. And then you can work like this, you can bring your arms to the side, and you can work like this. Right, so this, if you don't have a chair, this variation of Purvottanasana can be used. And if it's okay for you, Ellen, you can even test it out. Maybe you can let the head release down just a little bit more, okay? And then for you to come out, you just push and slide yourself all the way back over all of this stuff, okay? So everyone go ahead. Okay, Kate as well. So did you see that setup? You put a block here, right underneath there, and then you can extend away. Yeah, that's it. Make sure that your hips are on the bolster, right? So that your hips are not on the chair seat. Those of you on the chair, the hips are on the bolster itself. Yeah, Susie, does that feel okay? That's actually good. Yeah, good for you. This is a very, it's a tricky thing to say. It's a very treasured pose, Purvottanasana, right? Because we're now starting to support the back body in a different way. Supporting the back of the heart. And that we've opened the groin area to be able to do this pose now. So reach your inner heels to the wall, and those of you who can, you can reach the big toe mounds and the big toes down onto the floor and push into the wall. When you're ready, and this timing is entirely on you, you can take your arms overhead. But know that in this pose, there is so little doing. Can you be in that place of feeling? And feel where your breath is moving. And observing, again, how the breath moves through the entire torso. But unlike cross bolsters, Setu Bandha, that you did before, this pose has a different kind of sensitivity. The extension of your legs creates a longer breath. a breath with a different feeling in the abdominal cavity. And of all of the poses that we've done thus far, we now begin to make that transition from the breath being felt in the outer body to the breath being felt in the inner body. And the diaphragm itself has been referred to in many ancient texts as being the key to heaven, because it governs something that keeps us going in our external lives, and also something that begins to absorb our mind. And Mr. Iyengar would say that these back bends are very internalized poses. Observe the feeling of your breath. Where does it reach? Where is it felt? On a physical level, and now perhaps a little bit more on an emotional level. All right, and then from here, come on all the way out. Bend your legs first, bend your elbows. As I suggested, what I do is shift the bolster a little back and then sit up, and the bolster may hopefully just fall off your chair. Those of you in the cross bolster supported variation, you'll slide back to come on out. Okay, now stay in your seat, and you can even, if you're feeling this in your back, just lean slightly forwards into the back of the chair and just let your head release down. Because you can just soften it. All right, and then when you're okay, when you feel okay, you can come on out of your chair, and you don't need the chair anymore. And our final kind of, I'm going to call it supported back bend, requires even less out of us than the previous two that we have done. You don't need the wall for this. In fact, it's really important that you're not at the wall, or your feet don't touch the wall. We're going to be doing, I'm going to call it a variation, because most of us don't have 5 or 6 blocks. She would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 blocks. So this is called Bhishmacharya, and it's sometimes translated as the bed of arrows pose. There's an extraordinary story that goes along with this pose. And it's a pose that is taught therapeutically for grief and depression, surrender, right? Grief, depression, and surrender. So what you'll definitely need is 2 blocks, right? If you have 3 blocks, use 3 blocks, but most of us have 2, and so I'm going to show with 2 blocks. And in lieu of the 3rd block, you need to have a bolster and 1 or 2 blankets. All right, so I'm just going to show from here. So those of you who've been using the belt over your thighs, you'll definitely be using that again if you choose, because it's probably been giving you some similar, some feedback today already, which is important. So to start with, I have a bolster and a couple of blankets. This will be for your head. There's going to be a tall, narrow block, and this will be for behind your heart right? The middle back between the shoulder blades. And then this block that's going to be underneath your sacrum, right? So I'm going to show once you've got set up, I'm going to show. Those of you who are working with 3 blocks, this one can be, you can put a block instead of all of that stuff, okay? Does anyone have 7 blocks? No, you do. Okay, all right. Okay, so Rose, the thing with you use 7 blocks is that, well, I'll get 7 blocks. I'm not sure, because it does become kind of an interesting thing, but they do fall, so you just have to be a little careful. Let's see, no guarantees that I can do this, but we'll try. So if you have the 7 blocks, I'm going to show just with 3. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. And so they would basically be for your hands and your feet. So bed of arrows, right? You're just basically propping yourself up away from the earth and being held by the earth. So it's kind of an amazing pose. But before I show Rose what she's going to do, the basic structure for this is the key how to get in. You have to sit in front of this block and have the other one on hand. Now you have to lift the chest and support, a little too close, support basically the bottom edges of the shoulder blades on the block and lift the hips up and the head comes down. So then I have to lift my hips up higher and take the block underneath the sacrum. You can always adjust the one underneath your middle shoulder, in between the shoulder blades. Then your arms release. I don't know where the other blocks are, but the legs get to relax. So then you're just sort of supported from underneath. Okay, so this will be the next, the iteration of this one. So Rose, then it gets really interesting. And normally you would have a teacher come along and do the rest for you. But if you're on your own, of course, which we are, then it becomes this sort of dominoes game a bit, where you would have to structure your hands and your feet also on the blocks. I might even take the blocks a little lower, actually. So everyone go ahead and come on in, and Rose, you can see how this becomes a little bit of a game, but if you catch it, it's remarkable because you are completely suspended, except I always end up knocking the blocks over, so it does become a bit of a game. Something like that. Move that one a bit away. So there you go, Rose. So you're just completely off the floor. And so it's kind of amazing when you actually find this one. Because there's not much you can do. Because there's no, I think what this pose is fascinating for is that there is no room really for adjustments. Because if you adjust yourself, you fall off the blocks. Right? So you just have to surrender. Marina, yeah. The foam blocks are definitely tricky because they will bend, right? Can you feel that? Yeah, you can feel that. So I'm going to give you some of these wooden ones. So, because they really will. They're not stable. Yeah. I'm holding my breath. Yeah, so if you have foam blocks, just be careful because they are not so stable. All right, yeah, and that's good. Yeah, you can definitely use foam blocks under your hands. Yeah, and I see a lot of you actually have 6 blocks or however many. Yeah. Right, and then you can really feel, you have to have a block underneath the pelvis collar. Do you have a block under the pelvis? You have one under the back ribs and you have one under the pelvis. Right, so there are 2 blocks supporting the back body. Yeah, okay. So with with this pose, Bhishmacharasana, you'll notice that any adjustment you make, even if it's the movement of a finger, particularly those of you who are on complete block support, will affect every other part. And so at some point, the pose just requires a surrender. Let go of your legs, let go of your arms. Let the legs hang. Really important here that the feet are not touching the wall. And up until now, these poses that we've practiced have involved a level of sensitivity of feeling where the breath pushes and pulls and creates space. So just feel the breath in this pose. It's very quiet. For you're supporting the back of your heart. And feel the breath without any need for deep breaths. Just feel the even, quiet, soft ebb and flow of your breath. Full surrender, particularly on your exhaling breaths. Supporting yourself with this extraordinary superpower of your heart. Supporting yourself with the deepest level of loving kindness. Pema goes on to say, in regards to Maitri, that Maitri starts with realizing that whatever occurs is neither the beginning nor the end. It is the same kind of normal human experience that happens to people every day. And in this pose, we are invited to dissolve our resistance. Can you let your breath be part of that dissolving? Part of that surrender? Okay. You could stay in this pose for a lot longer, but we're going to come on out of it now. So to come out, be very careful. Bend your legs, bring your feet to the floor. And then you'll press your feet down, lift your hips up, move the block away from underneath your hips first. And then you can either roll to your side or lift yourself up. And just sit for a moment. Okay. So we're going to set up for Shavasana, and this is where you need your weight or your bag of rice. And it's optional, right? It's really optional. But you're going to take whatever support you need underneath your legs, right? Underneath your thighs, your knees, and you can take a blanket for your head. And just so that you can get into this efficiently, if you have your weight, and again, it's very, very much an optional weight. You can just place it on your heart. And, you know, it's not particularly even. I'm trying to actually get it so it's more like this, or more like this. You know, you have to find that position. And if it moves, don't use it. If it causes strain, don't use it. But you want to see if you can just find a place. I'm trying to flatten it out there. There we go. And just let the weight come down on your heart. A bag of rice, I think, is probably, or a narrow sandbag is one of the greater props. This is a square one. It's a little difficult to maneuver. And in the lieu, if you don't have a convenient bag of rice or something like that, you can just put a blanket over your heart, just like that. But only use it if it's helpful. And at this level of this practice today, what is helpful is not so much dictated by your mind. As I mentioned at the beginning, the practice was the stability of the body in asana comes from this integration of the mind and the body and the breath. If the sandbag or the weight seems too complicated because it's not staying in the right place, you can move it either to the tops of your thighs or you can move it onto the abdomen. And just for the next little while in Shavasana, to read a sentence from Prashant when he says, when you change anything, can you treat the breath like a patient in intensive care? With extreme sensitivity, observation, and loving kindness. Integrate the release of your body from your breath. And integrate the release of your breath from your body. The mind moves slightly outwards when we pay attention to the body, and slightly inwards when we pay attention to the breath. So that the three come together. No more duality. The way to dissolve our resistance to life is to meet it face to face. And when we feel resentment because the room is too hot, we could meet the heat and feel its fieriness and its heaviness. And when we feel resentment because the room is too cold, we could meet the cold and feel its iciness and its bite. And when we want to complain about the rain, we could feel its wetness instead. And when we worry about the wind shaking our windows, we could meet the wind and hear its sound. Cutting our expectations for cure is a gift we can give ourselves. For there is no cure for hot or cold. They will go on forever. The ebb and flow of life will still continue like the tides of the sea, like day and night. And this is the nature of things. Being able to appreciate, being able to look closely, and being able to open our minds. This is the core of Maitri. Gently move the weight away from your heart. Those of you who have it on your heart, and just replace it with your hands. Just be with your heart. Now, if you have an extra weight on your legs, just gently move that weight, and then you can bend your legs one at a time and roll to your right side. Just take a few moments on your side, or more than a few moments. You can lift your head last of all as you bring yourself up to sit. Close your eyes. Join your palms together at your chest. And as you bow your head to your heart, honor that part of you that always shows up. Namaste. Thank you for coming today.